A while back, I heard about a Switch controller which people were saying could reasonably compete with the quality of the Switch Pro controller that's become the standard controller of choice in the competitive scene, but for half the price. I reached out to the company that makes it, 8BitDo, and they graciously agreed to send me the controller so I could review it. To be clear, they're not paying me for the review. This isn't an ad, all these thoughts are my own. They just sent me the controller, and that's it. About a month and a half after they shipped it, the controller still hadn't arrived, and we concluded it got lost in the mail somewhere. I forgot to check my email for a bit and missed that they agreed to send another one. I apologized for the slow response and they sent it off again, and then it didn't arrive before I was out of town for the holidays for a few weeks. So now here we are, months after the moment when I first learned about this controller and reached out to the company, well after the holiday season is done, finally doing a review of the 8BitDo Ultimate Controller for the Switch. I'm going to be doing this review specifically as a Splatoon player, because that's what my channel is about. Hello, welcome to Squid School, an educational YouTube channel about competitive Splatoon and the self-improvement that comes with being a part of it. So there may be some aspects of my review that I gloss over which would interest, say, a PC gamer, but I'll try to be as thorough as I can. We'll start with what the controller comes with and its features before we get into the analysis of the pros and cons and everything. The available colors from the retailer are black, white, red, and blue, though if you're missing the color you want there, I'm sure there's someone you can find to customize it if that's something you're willing to pay for. With the controller, you're going to get a charging dock with a USB-C plug, which seems kind of unnecessary given that the controller itself also has a USB-C plug, but it's also a secret compartment where they hide the Bluetooth adapter you can plug into the computer's USB-A port, and I guess it makes the controller look nice when it's sitting there. There's also a USB-C to USB-A cable, which you'll use to sync the controller to the Switch in the same way you do with a Pro controller, and that you'll also use to connect it to your computer to use the controller software. The software is downloaded for free from 8BitDo's website, and it's the way you modify a lot of the functionality of the controller. For example, while the Switch allows for button remapping on controllers, there are two buttons on the 8BitDo controller that aren't on a Pro controller, those being the P1 and P2 buttons on the back of the controller's handles. So to assign any input to those buttons, you'll need to use the software. Quick aside, when I first looked into this, I ended up downloading the software for the Xbox version of the controller, which doesn't work for the Switch version, even though they're both called the Ultimate Controller. So just make sure you've grabbed the right one. Scroll down and make sure you see all of the available downloads. Anyway, there's a lot more to the software than just button remapping, and those extra features ended up being really important. By default, the rumble on the 8BitDo controller is way higher than it is on the Nintendo Pro controller, to the point where I was actually noticing subtle vibrations on screen from the rumble moving my hands and affecting the motion aim. Rumble happens all the time in Splatoon, notably whenever you're swimming through the ink, but on an official Pro controller it's barely even perceptible, so you often don't notice it. The software lets you turn the 8BitDo controller's rumble down to a setting that matches the Pro controller much more closely, and that resolved my problem with it. The other setting for me that was really important was for the triggers, but I'll talk about that a little later because that gets into the pros and cons aspect. There are two other tabs on the software. One of them is for the sticks, which offers some nice customization, like changing the active areas on the sticks, inverting them, swapping them around with other inputs, and limiting the D-pad to only 4 directions, potentially preventing certain missed inputs depending on the game. I didn't really mess with these very much because the default settings worked totally fine for my purposes. The other tab is for macros, which causes a bit of a headache for competitive players. This is challenging to comment on because, on one hand, macros can be used to cheat, offering stock combinations of button inputs that you can train the controller to use at an inhuman level of precision. On the other hand, there are uses for macros that can significantly enhance the accessibility of a game. For example, a macro that allows a squeezer player to tap shot at a speed that a person can realistically tap shot without anywhere near as much risk for an overuse injury would help a lot more people to play the squeezer safely. Tournaments generally ban macros outright to the fullest extent that they can enforce. If you're going to a LAN, currently the ruling is that only Nintendo licensed controllers are allowed, which, to my knowledge, would rule this controller out completely. At that point, just grab a first-party Pro controller. But some of the reasons for it being banned at a LAN don't carry over to online tournaments. An online tournament is a lot less worried about falling afoul of Nintendo's community guidelines. If you think the Nintendo ninjas are going so far as to spy on your controller usage in your house to get the TOs in trouble, please, by any means necessary, let us know. But otherwise, they frankly can't do anything about it even if they want to. There are a few other concerns related to the hardware TOs use at LANs, which makes Nintendo-only controllers more convenient and safe, but for reasons that generally only apply to LANs. It's also just a convenient ruling to make so that they sidestep the question of how to rule against and enforce macros and whatnot. None of the Nintendo licensed products that have gyro aim have turbo buttons, so as long as the rule is adhered to, there should never be any problems with that. There's no formal rule against using this controller in any online tournaments that I'm aware of, so as long as you're not cheating, which should be pretty easy to verify just from looking at your perspective in replay mode, you shouldn't get in trouble for trying to use it in that kind of event. And obviously, if you're only planning on playing online multiplayer solo or casually with friends, this is a non-issue for you. Whatever settings you land on with the controller, you'll save those into one of 3 profiles that get saved to the controller once you close the software. From there, you can cycle between each of the profiles at will using a button on the controller, which I found to be really intuitive and convenient once I had the profiles set up properly. It was useful for testing out how different configurations work side by side, because while it takes a bit to plug the controller in, pull up the software, change the settings, and save them, you can bring 3 of those profiles at a time into the training room and just toggle between them at will to see how they each feel in direct comparison to each other. That was how I worked out what I wanted to do with the trigger buttons, and now that we've covered the features, it's time to get back to that. The biggest problem I have with this controller for Splatoon players is that the trigger buttons don't work the same way as the trigger buttons on a Pro controller. The Nintendo brand Pro controller triggers are just binary. You've either pushed them down far enough that they click and something happens, or they haven't clicked and they're not considered pressed. They only ever move a few millimeters total before they hit the shell of the controller and physically cannot be pressed any further down. The 8BitDo Ultimate controller's trigger buttons, on the other hand, have a significant range of motion before they bottom out, more than a centimeter. Since Splatoon is designed around the Pro controller's binary pressed or not pressed triggers, it has no use for all of that extra depth, and you inevitably run into one of 2 problems depending on the setting you choose for the trigger buttons. One problem is that you have to press the button a lot further down to be able to activate something really fundamental and important, like entering swim form or firing your weapon. That makes the controller a little bit less responsive. It slows you down a bit. Now, in the software settings, you can change the active and inactive regions of the triggers so that you don't have to press the trigger all the way down, and you save yourself time starting up any of those actions. You can make it so that you barely have to press the trigger at all to get your weapon to fire, for example. That, though, is when you get the other possible problem. Since the button isn't going to immediately naturally be stopped by the shell of the controller when you press it, you'll probably end up pressing it further than you need to, and it'll take more time to snap back up for you to be able to press it again. Any weapon that requires repeated button presses is going to get messed up by this to some degree. For example, when I tried this out using a brush and having the largest trigger activation region I could set, I would try to mash the button to attack someone, and the first flick would go through, but then when I pressed down a second time, the button hadn't fully reset to its neutral position yet, and pressing it a second time didn't cause it to flick a second time. From the controller's perspective, I had never actually released the trigger button, and so it thought I was just holding the button down, intending to put the brush on the ground and start running with it. So instead of using the window of opportunity I had to attack someone, I flicked at them once, and then stopped attacking and started running around out in the open. I lost multiple fights in just that one game to that mistake. This sort of thing could cause a squeezer to go from tap shot mode to rapid fire mode and lose the range they need to hit someone, or eat an input and make a bucket player who hit someone once stand still without sloshing the second time to confirm the splat. The ZL button also messed with my movement because of this setting, in that I missed a lot more ledge cancels. Ledge canceling requires a very carefully timed release of the ZL button, followed by slamming it back down again with the right timing once you're up and over the top of the ledge. And if the trigger doesn't fully reset when you release it, the controller thinks you were holding ZL down the whole time, and you end up just flying up over the top as if you hadn't tried to ledge cancel at all. I fixed this and had no further issues by increasing the inactive region a little more, but it's something where you'll have to mess with it a bit to find out where the sweet spot is for you. As a Splattershot player, where my weapon is fully automatic, so mashing doesn't do anything for me, I'm fine with just setting ZR to have a really, really small inactive region, and I was able to play just fine. But I could see these settings with the trigger buttons making or breaking the experience for a player whose weapon requires repeated trigger button inputs to fire. And even if you get the settings exactly where you want them, the extra range of motion you have to account for probably leads to at least a slight slowdown in your fire rate compared to an official Pro controller. The range of motion is fine, probably necessary for some PC games, for which this controller also works and is therefore designed to work, and so I can see why they'd be designed that way. But it would be better for Switch users to have a different version of the controller where the triggers have a minimal range of motion, since that's how all the first-party Switch controllers are designed, and that's what the games are meant for. Does that mean I don't recommend the controller? Not necessarily. One thing to consider is that this controller only costs around $35 in comparison to the roughly $70 you'd pay for a new Pro controller. Unless you're planning on competing at a LAN, at which point you're willing to pay hundreds of dollars and travel across the country to play this game, so the extra money probably isn't that big of an investment to you. I could totally see myself getting used to this controller and playing with it for a long time, and performing pretty much identically in a competitive setting. The motion aim works just as well as it does on the Pro controller, and the buttons and sticks all feel well made. The D-pad in particular just feels straight up better than the one on the Pro controller, not that that's a big deal for Splatoon at all. It has all the same inputs as a Switch Pro controller, including equivalents to the home button, plus and minus, and the screen cap button. There were 2 instances where I noticed stick or motion drift, only one of which is any kind of concern for the controller's performance in-game. Whenever I would change the controller's settings and reconnect it to the Switch, my aim would always spend a few seconds steadily drifting to one side before it would abruptly stop and never happen again for the rest of the session. It almost feels like it just takes a second to calibrate or something. Not sure what caused that, but once I realized it was predictable, didn't last very long, and it got it out of its system in the lobby before a match could possibly start, I was never worried about it again. Now, in the other instance, the gyro aim was drifting a bit on the map screen while I was trying to select someone to jump to, and that was disruptive. I feel like that might actually be an issue with the software, though, because it never happened while I was trying to aim my weapon, and when I got back into the lobby and opened up the turf map from there, it was totally steady. I've had that sort of drift happen before on Nintendo controllers as well, so I wouldn't call that a weakness of this particular controller in comparison to the Switch Pro controller at the very least. One aspect that might be nice for some players is that the controller is just a little bit smaller than the Pro controller, and some people with smaller hands might appreciate that. The face buttons and sticks are slightly smaller, which just feels proportional to the controller being smaller and didn't cause me any problems with, say, missing a button because I'm used to it being someplace else. For me personally, putting my pointer fingers where I want them on top of the trigger buttons creates a gap between the handles of the 8BitDo controller and the palms of my hands, and that doesn't happen with the Pro controller. So for me, the Pro controller is more comfortable. But that's not a huge deal. It's something I could easily get used to if I had to, and someone with smaller hands than I have would probably like it better. If you're interested in having the 2 buttons on the back to remap inputs to, this is a great choice, though for me personally at least, those aren't super well positioned to be easy to hit with my fingers, and so I ended up scrapping the idea after messing with them for a few minutes. I would also recommend the controller if you do, for some legitimate reason, want the macros, as I haven't played a better made controller with a turbo button. I've only had the controller for a week, of course, and it would take a matter of months, or more likely years, to assess how durable it is in comparison to the Pro controller. That said, I've been playing video games for a long time, and used a lot of different controllers up to their breaking points, some third-party, some first-party. So I think I have an okay sense of the quality of a controller's materials and how well it's built by feel. This is the closest I've felt to the quality of materials and sturdiness of a first-party Nintendo controller. Definitely for the Switch, but maybe even out of any other Nintendo console. It feels better than the Power 8 controllers for sure, and those ones didn't feel bad themselves. Considering the 8BitDo controller is at a much lower price point than the Pro controller, that's pretty impressive to me, and may speak to Nintendo's ability to mark up their first-party products. Huge thanks to 8BitDo for sending me the controller, and for raising the bar for third-party hardware off the floor where it was at. I've seen some really crappy third-party controllers, but this is definitely not one of them. If you're looking to buy a new Switch controller for playing Splatoon, there are definitely some cases at least where I'd recommend it, and I'd encourage you to think about which variables, the cost, trigger buttons, size, customization, legality at LAN tournaments, matter the most to you when deciding between this and the official Pro controller.